Today, I'm delighted to welcome back Keir Giles. We're going to be talking about Russia's attempts to get at the data of its enemies. And of course, we're talking here about specialists, analysts, those who are at the forefront of the fight against Russian imperialism. But we want to make the case this could happen to anyone who has information that is useful to Russia's purposes. Before we jump in, quick introduction to Keir Giles. He spent his career watching, studying, and explaining Russia. His work has appeared in a wide range of academic and military publications across Europe and in North America. He's a regular contributor and commentator on Russian affairs for international print and broadcast media, and he is a senior consulting fellow at the UK's Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House. Well, we're going to dive into this topic. Before we do, a huge thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and the usual methods. It really does help to keep the work going day in, day out to fight Russian criminal propaganda. And of course, anyone who supports the work of Chatham House, reading their reports, attending their events, will know how important that work is. And of course, that is one of the reasons why you were the attempt to hack your data, wasn't it, Keir?
Well, it seems that way. Of course, we can never be absolutely sure what the real reason was, just as we don't know what the real motivation was. Even if some of the repercussions later give us an indication of what the objective was, we don't get into the minds of the people who are actually doing this. We can only make reasonable guesses as to what's going on. But it's normal for people in my position and the others that you've talked about to be the subject of unwelcome attention online and in real life. Something that I wrote about in great detail in the book back in 2022, Russia's War on Everybody, the way people are caught up in really being the victims of what Russia does, whether they like it or not sometimes, whether they have set themselves up in opposition to Moscow or are just caught in the crossfire completely unawares. But in any case, yes, it's normal and habitual for people in my job to be the subject of hacking attempts. Some of them extremely crude, extremely basic, extremely obvious, and some of them, like this latest example, either very clever or using an entirely new method that's never been seen before, or as seems to have happened in this case, both at the same time.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because before we get into the details of the hack, this suggests that if a novel methodology is being used, if it's complicated and there's quite a large, I would say, upfront investment in the process, then that suggests some form of operation. It suggests allocation of resources, and it also suggests that numerous people would be involved, not just in the physical hack, but in the prioritization, choosing who to target with this methodology. So do you have a concept of what the sort of the hierarchy or the food chain of Russian attacks is? And does this start to sit, much higher up the up that food chain?
Well, there are people who spend a lot more time and effort than me looking into who does what within the Russian system. And this attack has been the subject of studies by Citizen Lab, by Google, by a couple of other cyber security companies that routinely track all of these different bad actors within the Russian system and allocate them all of the code names that we might have been hearing over past years. Cozy Bear, Fancy Bear, the Dukes, Seaborgium, all of the different names and numbers that are given to these, sometimes lots of them refer to the same organization. They've just been allocated by different cybersecurity organizations. It can be very confusing, but the key point, of course, is that most people don't need to worry about it because if you take sufficient precautions to secure your account, you are likely to be proof against most of these, no matter what flavor they may be, no matter what label they may go under, unless and until, as we're talking about now, somebody makes the decision to put a lot of resources and a lot of manpower and some assets that they are willing to burn into a particular attack. You might be familiar with the term a 0 day vulnerability, a cyber attack that is undocumented, something, a new way of attacking that has been discovered by researchers that are working on the other side, and 0 day because it's 0 days since it was detected. Well, what this seems to have been is a 0 day cognitive hack. It's a brand new thing which has a lot of value because once it's discovered, as it has been now, it loses a lot of its power. It's been documented, it's been explained, people will be on their guard against it. And so it is of greatly less value than before it was discovered. So yes, all of that talks to a major effort and somebody somewhere taking the decision that this had to have resources allocated to it.
Now, you were already on your guard as a professional, not just a Russia watcher. You are a Russia explainer, and I would say you're at the most correctly at the most cynical end of that, explaining Russian aggression, foreign policy, criminality, and imperialism, for want of a better word. So you're already, you're already on the lookout for the cruder attempts to hack, and you may be getting those with a relative degree of frequency. So it seems here there's a certain amount of conscious effort thinking, well, what do we have to do to fool Keir Giles? Because the normal stuff just isn't going to work.
Well, indeed, the normal stuff hasn't worked, and indeed some of the abnormal stuff hasn't worked. Because in addition to the reasons for caution that you talked about just then, I've also been looking at Russian information and cyber warfare for a long time. So, relatively speaking, I'm better informed about what's going on than an average member of the population. So, yes, it needed to be something which was better than and more clever and better presented than anything we'd seen before, in spite of there being quite a long history of novel attacks being apparently using me as the first victim, or at least the first person to wave a red flag about it. There's a Reuters journalist named Raphael Satter who's been tracking some of the ways in which I've been targeted, among other people, and he wrote a fairly uh, wry thread on Blue Sky after this attack, saying, "Here we are writing about Keir Giles again," and he was speculating as to why it is I seem to be such a threat magnet for some of these very novel attacks. Back in 2019, there was Katie Jones, who was the first deepfake enabled profile on LinkedIn that was documented as part of a campaign. We never really figured out what the campaign was for, but it was a new and innovative attack. A little bit later on, there was another very well crafted phishing attack where I was just about to click on the link before realizing that it was deceptive. And this link was so well put together that I was convinced it was a real appointment reminder from my actual real life optician. So the ways people actually craft these things to make them convincing can sometimes betray a great deal of effort put into them. But then, of course, there is always going to be a time when it's your luck runs out and something does catch you. And in this particular case, it is so well crafted that I don't often after the fact you look back and you kick yourself for not spotting something obvious. In this particular case, it was so well done that I don't even feel particularly bad about having fallen for it.
And I'll come in a minute because my channel is the subject of an attempted hack or takeover, and unfortunately in this instance, I did fall for it, and in hindsight, it seems a little foolish, but it was people reaching out with advertising opportunities for the channel, and it just coincided with a number of genuine offers and a huge raft of not genuine ones, and of course they point you to websites, landing pages. They point you to social media profiles that look relatively well populated. And these emails don't have the normal typos and, Nigerian prince kind of stuff, which is the usual flags. They looked entirely plausible. But it also fed, in my instance, into something that was rather tempting, which was sort of, juicy sponsorship deal, which you work on a channel for a number of years and suddenly they come along and you're like, hooray! Um, I clicked on the link and it installed an exe onto my system. It didn't do the process that was advertised, but what it did do is I think it started trying to siphon off all the data on my system to goodness knows where. Fortunately, I knew how to kill that, and I had double encryption on my systems. But this was a crude attempt, and I would say probably quite automated as well, because I'm sure they didn't craft all that just for me. They crafted it for any number of YouTube channels, not just ones that are sort of, I would say, pro-Ukraine and so on. So when it comes back to the idea of resources, if you're going to use crypto hackers or assets as a kind of, go-between, the GRU can merge things that are already out there, malicious entities that are making money for other reasons, and it can piggyback off them. This doesn't seem to be the case in your attack. This seems to be absolutely crafted to get you and to get specific information that your systems may contain. So what was the risk there, and what do you think they were after?
Well, it's hard to say, of course, as we were talking about a moment ago, what exactly the objective is. You can't tell for certain. But those differences in approach are some of the factors that have led some of the people who've looked at this account to say, actually, in this case, they suspect it is not the GRU for a change. It's not Russia's military intelligence, but the Foreign Intelligence Service, which they have seen deploying a different style and a different method, not just online.
SVR, would it be?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, we are. Yes. Now, Google says they attribute this with, as they say, low confidence to a threat actor that is associated with the SVR. But if you look at the way this unfolded, it was very different from what you described. It wasn't a big splashy offer to get me excited. It was something routine. It wasn't pressuring me into following a link. It was a long, slow process of developing a rapport, arriving at a time when we could talk. And it put a lot of effort into the what I call the pillars of plausibility, all of the different things that make it look legit. Initial approach was from a State Department email, copying in a Gmail address, however, with lots of different State Department addresses to reply to. Now, if you don't know, as I didn't, that if you write to non-existent people at the US State Department, you won't get an error message, then that is one of the ways in which they bolster the idea that this must be legit, because otherwise you're sending in emails to the State Department and nothing's happening. Another way they made it look as though this was a process, a normal and natural process of going through tech support to actually connect to somebody else's system, was setting up the lure as ms.state.gov. In other words, something that looks very much like an official State Department domain name, something you would not be able to spoof or to fake. So again, it's something that bolsters this idea that this has to be a legit operation, because otherwise it makes no sense. So the actual technical means by which this was done, and this is where I'm quite concerned that a lot of people out there don't necessarily know that this is even possible. So it could be actually something that's dangerous for a great deal more people, is using a method of opening up people's Gmails or email or other apps that is less secure than all of the security methods we are routinely told to undertake. It's a side door into our accounts that is left there deliberately for apps or for other devices that can't actually meet those security requirements. Now, that's come as a bit of a surprise that this even exists to a lot of the people that I've spoken to that are not deep in the cybersecurity industry. And the analogy that comes up time and again is we're told to put all of these security precautions, all of these locks on our front door, but there's still a tradesman's entrance with the key under the mat for devices or applications that can't actually meet those security requirements. And that's what these attackers very carefully, very slowly, and really quite cleverly coaxed me into opening up for them, because I didn't know that that side door existed.
And that is, of course, very concerning. Now, I don't know if this affects a process which actually, unfortunately, many people use, and that is to use their Google account details to allow access to numerous other products and services. That could be Google Ads, could be YouTube, it could be AdSense, which is the payment mechanisms. It could be numerous other social media profiles, apps, logins, etc. And it's fairly standard practice to use your main social details or Google account to gain access to these across multiple devices. This suggests that this is rather a dangerous vulnerability. Given that Google has been investigating this as a case study, do you have any indication that key services like Microsoft and Google may tighten this up and close this back door, because it has really some really shocking implications?
Well, I think you may be referring to single sign-on, using your Google account to validate access to other services. No, it's worse than that. Much worse than that. This is not that means of accessing different accounts. It is a much older method of bypassing security for devices that will not support the kind of security that's built into your normal account validation. And this is something that whenever you look at the literature about it, it's going back to the previous decade. In fact, Google said they would start to phase this out, this access for what they call less secure applications from Google Workspaces, their in-house office suite for Gmail and other services in 2019. But still haven't done it today. And they still say they need to keep it in place for people's ordinary Gmail so that they can still connect with their other devices and services. Other service providers like Microsoft, for example, they still have this system as well, but it's something which is not particularly prominent in anybody's technical documentation. So having looked into where this is described and where the explanations are of what it does, I'm a great deal less surprised that it came as a startling discovery to me and also to so many other people that I've talked about, that this hangover from a previous, less secure age of online presence is still there and still ready to be exploited, more or less for anybody.
And we've discussed numerous times about Western countries and many individuals in the West not thinking of themselves at war with Russia. And I think the phrase that you coined, which has been used many times, many people probably unaware that you're the source, and that is, you may not be interested in Russia, but Russia is interested in you. You may be interested in war, but Russia's war is coming for you. Are there longer term implications here that if we were to attain a higher state of alert, a higher state of confrontation with Russia, that some of these vulnerabilities that they've gained, they may not even be using them immediately. They may be serving them or keeping them in their back pocket for such a time when, as I say, this confrontation steps up a gear.
Well, I think that's a possibility, not just with this particular method of attack, but in general, with cyber power actually being present in somebody else's networks, ready for the time when you need to do something about it, is a standard part of the positioning for conflict that goes on more or less constantly, and that includes, of course, accessing individuals that you want to have an effect on, or to close down, or to make unable to communicate at the given moment. But what we're talking about here is, in fact, a much broader and much bigger problem than this, because it doesn't just affect the people who Russia might be thinking of as a target, even the ones that fall into their net as collateral damage. It actually affects everybody. Because what the cybersecurity gurus have been telling me is that now that this method has been documented and displayed and demonstrated, they're expecting it to be used much, much, much more widely. And because this is such a common vulnerability in so many millions of people's email accounts, and by and large, those people are going to be a great deal less suspicious than you or I of their invitations to open up this method into their accounts, this route into their emails, there's likely to be far more widespread use of this tool, affecting far, far more people than just us in the Russia watching community.
And, without going into detail necessarily, is there information that they could have accessed in your systems, intelligence and information they wouldn't have known about that could be operationally useful? Or is it far more likely they're simply wanting to disrupt and punish in some way an individual like yourself who is extremely active in pointing out their criminality and their intent?
Well, again, we cannot know exactly what the objective was, but those two things are not mutually exclusive. They may be looking for something which they may or may not have found, because who knows what it is they're searching for. It could be that this is a part of what we've seen previously as hack, forge, dump attacks, where they siphon out material from somebody's email account and then doctor it before releasing it through some of their willing proxies in the West to try to attack and disparage the critics of Russia. We don't know, and that may or may not happen. If it does, then we know the well-worn routine, and we know the likely suspects who are going to be releasing it. But of course, there's no point in actually worrying about what's in the email account for two reasons. So first of all, knowing that this was more or less inevitable anyway, I don't write emails without the expectation that eventually they'll be made public. And second, if they don't find what they're hoping for in terms of compromise or embarrassing material or something that they want to prove, then they'll just make it up anyway, release it as a forgery. So in that respect, there's little point in being unduly concerned about the contents of somebody's email inbox.
And of course, it could be a stepping stone to spoofing other accounts and trapping other people. So they could use access to your communications to plausibly craft a response to previous threads or dialogues you've had with various people. And of course, they could suck out emails of your colleagues. And using AI, it's easy to imagine this kind of attack could have an exponential implication in that they could very quickly, target all of your community, your extended community, and your network, and use some of that information they've managed to hack in your system in order to build these plausible communications to repeat the trick.
Well, that's exactly right. And of course, that's one of the major problems when they do open up this access. Not only if somebody takes over your account that can email from it appearing to be you, but also with access to all of the information that's in there. As you say, carry on previous conversations, build the plausibility of an approach to somebody else. And that's the reason why, as soon as I discovered what had happened, my very first action was to lunge for social media and my contact list and saying, be wary of things that come from me that you're not expecting, because that, of course, is the danger period, the first period after this is opened up, when they could exploit that lack of awareness that it has happened.
And you were recently involved in, I think, not that Chatham House isn't high profile, of course, amongst experts it is, but you were involved in a much more sort of public forum, which was, I think, a television program that sort of imagined what would happen if Britain was standing alone against a Russian attack. Is it plausible that that has raised your profile or the perception that you're a threat? Is it perhaps also the case? And here I'm admitting something which I really shouldn't admit to, and that is I haven't yet seen the program. Um, did you envisage a scenario in that program where there was a full-scale cyber attack to try and bring down not just our infrastructure but our entire network of communications and trust?
Well, I can tell you haven't seen the program because it's actually a podcast. The main output is actually audio. It's from Sky News and it's called The War Game. And it does map out why and how Russia might choose to mount a coercive attack on the United Kingdom and how the UK might be able to respond, or in some cases not. I really do recommend a listen, and I'll send over a link, Jonathan, you can post with this recording when it goes out. And yes, there was an expectation among the participants in it that we might get a little bit of hostile reaction from the Russian side as a result of doing this. And it's tempting to read into the timeline that this was somehow connected. The announcement of the podcast and the going live dates came shortly before the first approach in this campaign. But I don't think it is likely that it's directly connected, because this is plainly something that took a lot of preparation, a lot of lead up time, and a lot of human resources and man hours to put together. So I think it is far more plausible that it was actually planned and initiated very much earlier.
And of course, it's in some ways it may be comforting to think that Russian aggression is not so targeted, is not so rational. Unfortunately, I think it's very rational. And you're talking here about the allocation of resource. Alongside that, there must be a rationalization of who is deserving of that resource and who is not, or which different layers of resource, intensification of resource, are required at different levels. Running this channel, communicating a lot with activists on the ground and external to Ukraine, I start to get a sense of where these gradations start to lie. And it seems that the higher levels, those where you have actual human operatives assigned, as opposed to troll farms or bots at the lower levels, is when you're having an impact, quite clearly. So I don't tend to get, in fact, I haven't been targeted by, I would say, operational resources until I went to Ukraine in 2023. And it was only in the context of running an event there that we had someone assigned to us to try and disrupt the event. They were either pretending to be an American journalist or they're an American journalist in the pay of the Russian services. But they tried to discourage the speakers of that event from attending by telling lies to one speaker about another speaker. And actually, a third of our speakers dropped out 24 hours before the event, but we managed to find a whole bunch more. So it was all fine. But it seems that physical operational resources and different degradations of that, gradations of that, really are targeted often at volunteers, people on the ground, those who have joined the armed forces of Ukraine, and it would seem those who have an impact like yourself. So do you get a sense of this landscape and the rationalization process that may take place within both GRU and SVR?
Yes, and that's something that's been very palpable, not just in the last few years, but throughout the whole story of Russia being able to reach out and touch people online. The very crude, the very basic, the very automated systems for low value targets, and if there's something that they feel that it is worth actually engaging in, then allocation of far more sophisticated and far more labor intensive methods of either causing trouble or in some cases actually trying to sway people to their side. So yes, it's been a persistent feature. I was surprised and impressed that they decided to burn so many of these resources and this tool, which is now out in the open, on me of all people. And I suppose one good thing that's come out of this is that if they're using all of that on me, then somebody else who's far more important in the grand scheme of things is actually being neglected as a result. So that's a positive outcome.
Oh, you definitely shouldn't undersell yourself there. I think the process of explaining Russian imperialism to the world is one of the most important activities of the moment. If we're gonna sort of in the last sort of segment of the conversation, let's zoom out a little bit because we've talked on a number of occasions about Russian sub-threshold warfare. We've talked about sabotage and so on. But we're in perhaps a not unexpected position, but a rather curious one, which is that Putin, who seems to only have one gear, which is escalation. I mean, aggression is a default. Escalation is the only gear he has. He seems to have his back against the wall at this point. The economy is in something of a dire state. The huge financial bubble that has been created to support their military industrial complex and the retooling is starting to potentially have an impact on the banking and property system. And for the first time that I can remember, or at least since Khodorkovsky was humiliated and humbled by Putin, it seems that regime economists have actually spoken out relatively publicly, including German Gref, who one wouldn't have expected comments from him. So it seems there are some serious problems going on. My interpretation is that Putin does not de-escalate in these crises, but he chooses his default, which is escalation. There is speculation that that could be a sub-threshold of Article 5 kind of incursion of some sort. It has been speculated by Anders Puck Nielsen, who's on my channel, a Danish military specialist, that actually he expects some full Article 5 form of aggression, but one which is calculated to not necessarily provoke a full response, especially if the US is not is on the fence there. What do you think we should expect from this point on? Are we going to get more, like the attacks you've talked about, potentially arson, sabotage, maybe assassination, or are we going to get a full Article 5 challenge?
Well, let me agree with all of the facts that you put there and disagree with all of the interpretation. So, yes, you're absolutely right. The economic position is finally dire for Russia, and it's becoming very clear to anybody that's willing to pay attention within the Russian system that they are in the economic trouble that has been predicted for so long because of all of the reasons that were blindingly obvious. But I don't think it's right to say that Putin's only gear is to escalate. Because we have seen on many previous occasions that when confronted and when there are going to be costs imposed that are actually meaningful, Putin, like Russian leaders before him, has no problem at all cutting his losses and withdrawing, de-escalating in order to not to make things worse. The problem we have in the current situation is he's never actually been confronted with those costs. He's never been tested. There's never been a demonstration of resolve by Western powers to try to prevent Russia either mounting the full scale of invasion of Ukraine in 2022 in the first place, or committing all of the countless atrocities within it. There was not the declaration of a no-fly zone or a maritime exclusion zone before February 2022, let alone Western forces on the ground in the manner that had been proposed to try to prevent that Russian full-scale invasion. So, of course, Putin is going to push forward. because he finds that everybody folds before him, and pushing forward is the way to get more out of the situation. Even with the so-called peace talks with the United States at the moment, the decision has plainly been made, the assessment has been made within the Kremlin that it doesn't make sense at the moment to freeze the conflict by accepting the offer from the United States, despite the enormous numbers of casualties that Russia is suffering on a day-to-day basis. And instead, they can get more by pushing on. And of course, they do get more. They receive more gifts, more rewards from the Kremlin, like this latest suspension of military aid to Ukraine. So it makes sense for them to push forward unless and until somebody says stop. And for the time being, nobody has said stop. Now, when it comes to the scenarios for testing Article 5 in such a way that it falls over and NATO evaporates in a puff of raison d'etre because it doesn't actually do its main job, yes, of course, these are things we've been speculating about for the last 20 years. How exactly Russia could engineer such a scenario where it tests the strength of the NATO alliance and the NATO alliance is found wanting. And that's where scenarios like the one in the Sky News podcast we talked about, the war game, come in. Because it's not necessarily the case that those tests will be against the frontline states, which have spent an awful lot of time, resources, and money in making themselves hard targets. Instead, it could be the soft, juicy European hinterland with an even greater political impact because those other countries are so unprepared. Now, the war game takes the case study of the United Kingdom and looks at all of the ramifications from that, how the United States would respond, how allies would respond, what the implications are for European security as a whole. But it could be any one of those other Western European states that have not taken national defense as seriously as they should have done and as the frontline states have done.
And I was about to say, of course, there's ambiguous signals coming from the US, but actually they're not ambiguous at all. They're getting very strong signals, or Putin on his side will be getting signals of state capture and coercive manipulation, and his narratives being seeded throughout the media, and even many people in the Trump administration repeating clear Kremlin narratives. He may be getting the signal there that there's really no pushback going to be coming from that quarter. And indeed, not only can he escalate in Ukraine, which he's doing, but as you suggested, there could be other fronts he could open, which again would go relatively uncontested.
Absolutely right. Yes. The more confident Putin is that he can do things without the Americans taking exception, the more danger Europe is in.
And there's another wild card here, which is delusion. One could say that his response or his prediction of the Western response to his invasion of Ukraine was pretty accurate. His prediction of the behavior of Ukrainians was not. There's a high degree of delusion and misunderstanding of Ukraine there. It seems now that Putin's delusion is out of kilter with even many of the people in his own regime. If we look at his comments around the economy, he's getting extremely clear and sharp messages that, they're going to hit a brick wall. His response is to almost defy gravity or to call on his administration to defy the laws of physics, basically, to say, well, we will not expect, we will not accept high inflation. We will not accept this. We will not accept that. If part of his thinking is based on sheer delusion, then he could make some very unfortunate decisions.
Yes, there are two things that come out of that. First of all, when assessing whether Russia under Putin or any other leader might embark on some military misadventure in the future, sometimes we put too much store in Western assessments of whether this would actually benefit Russia without realizing that they can, in fact, be wildly wrong and wildly misguided as to the timing of launching their attacks, just as they were with Ukraine, completely misreading the situation and misunderstanding what would happen when they went in. Not, as you say, misreading the West, because the West had made it very clear that they knew precisely what Russia was going to do and they weren't going to do anything to stop it, but misreading what would happen when they actually marched into a neighboring country. But then, yes, is it the case that Putin is simply willing to return to his Soviet comfort zone and issue decrees that inflation is not going to happen? Or is it that he still accepts that there is bound to be catastrophic economic damage to the country as a result of the campaign to re-establish its empire, but he doesn't care? Press on regardless because our mission is so much more important than what the economy and what people's standards of living are going to suffer as a result.
Now, there's two more questions here before we sort of top it out. One is a big geopolitical question, and one is a very local question. Let's start with the big geopolitical one because it follows on from what you've just said. There was an extraordinary statement. I'm not sure if it was public or not, but it was reported by a number of European diplomats who apparently heard this. And I think it was a sort of deputy foreign minister of China who said to European audience that China cannot afford for Russia to lose. And that is a statement of extraordinary, I would say, connection with Putin's aggression, and even a commitment to it that makes what we have been speculating about far more explicit. Are Russia and North Korea essentially vassals of China? And are they carrying out essentially a policy which is deemed to be beneficial to China? And should we be making those connections far more explicitly?
I think it's reasonable to say that if China decided that what Russia was doing was not beneficial, it would stop, because China by now has such a hold over what Russia chooses to do that it can exert its influence to actually bring the conflict to an end. But as we've heard, it doesn't actually want to do that because of the consequences. Now, you're right; it was an out of the ordinary statement, and it does run counter to all of the conciliatory noises that we've heard from China up until now. But it makes sense because for China, it is entirely comfortable for their two major adversaries to be weakening each other. If that stops and the one that is closer aligned with China comes out on the losing side, then of course that's a problem for China. It stands to reason. But in general, it's another indication that nobody by now should be thinking of Russia's war on Europe as just a European problem. Instead, it is just one aspect of that global confrontation between the Krink and all of those who think like them, and whichever countries are willing to stand in defense of the rules-based international order that had kept them secure up until then.
And does that statement also perhaps shed some light, or does it make the probability of an invasion of Taiwan more likely, or at least shed light on China's intentions towards Taiwan?
I don't think it gives much of an indication that anything has changed in terms of China's intent toward Taiwan. The concern was more, well, if the European problem is put to bed, then it is even easier for the United States to concentrate all its resources on Asia Pacific, which is a problem for China. But I think instead we need to think back to the first principles that plenty of people in Taiwan say that it is vital for Ukraine to stand against Russia and to be supported in doing so, because that is the greatest deterrent to aggression around the world by other more powerful neighbors that hanker after their neighbors' territory, like, for example, China and Taiwan. It is the principle that is at stake and the principle that the United States is no longer apparently interested in defending.
And the last question here, which is a little closer to home, there have been some extraordinary stories over the last couple of months of fires at numerous electricity substations. If you look at the sort of background incidents of such things, they're not unknown, but certainly not in this kind of concentration that they've been seen. We had the massive fire at Heathrow, which shut the airport down for a period of time. And we've had all sorts of transport network issues, let's say in France and Europe, which are more explicitly linked to Russian assets, etc. And of course, there were the fires at Keir Starmer's house, and that again is more explicitly linked to Russian activity. But the substation fires in Heathrow, is this a sign the country's falling apart, or should we perhaps be a little more, let's say, suspicious-minded about the causes?
Well, as so often, you present me with an either-or question, and I say, why is it not both at the same time? Because both apply. As for the campaigns of sabotage and reconnaissance of critical infrastructure across Europe and in the United Kingdom and beyond, that really is something that we could talk at great length about because it is It's something which, if anybody wants the background reading on what this actually looks like, as so often, don't look at anything recent, look back at previous decades. At the end of 2019, the Swedish Defense Research Agency, FOI, put together a study that was all about how the fad at the time for A2AD, anti-access and area denial, was overblown and misleading. You might recall, if you have that long a memory, there was a time of lots of forbidding looking red circles and domes on maps that looked like no-go areas where you could not penetrate because of Russian missiles. It was like these medieval charts with big vague areas with here be tigers. Don't go in there because the Russians will get you. The Swedes were saying, no, that's actually not the case. This is not how these things work. They do have the limitations. And of course, by 2022, they were proven right very comprehensively. But the last chapter of that, my bit, was about how Russia could immobilize Europe without firing a single missile in advance of hostilities by using all of the methods that we're seeing in play today. By targeting the logistics, the communications, the personnel, the emergency preparedness, using cyber attacks, proxies, GPS jamming, all of the different things that we're seeing happening now. It's basically like ticking off the list of what do we expect Russia to do before it mounts a full-scale attack on a NATO member state.
And of course, the use of mass drone warfare may well render what platforms we do have fairly redundant. I mean, Ukrainians day by day retune their systems to hold the Russian aggression at bay, but European armies are just not used to that. So, do you think a kind of Russian blitzkrieg combined with all of these, let's say, non-kinetic techniques, actually could prove much more effective than we realize?
Well, that too is a whole other episode because this very intense debate that we have at the moment about whether countries should be investing in old school heavy metal, tanks, heavy artillery, etc., or going all in on drones and new technology, or some mixture of it is really the bet that needs to be made about how to draw lessons from the Ukraine conflict in order to keep other countries safe, if and when they're actually willing to spend the money about it. And it is a very, very high stakes game. But for that, I think really you need to get two people on your podcast, two people with very strong opposing views about whether you need to go for old school mass or complete technological innovation, or maybe something like the UK Strategic Defence Review, somewhere fall between the two, but not actually offer up any money to pay for it anyway.
Well, that's a panel I definitely like to put together. I have a few ideas of who on the Ukrainian side could put the case for combined drone arms, but we'll maybe put our grey cells to work to see who we can put onto such a panel. For today, though, Keir, thank you so much for coming on. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday evening. We're going to go and have our tea now, I think, in this house at least. So I'm very grateful, especially that you're able to come on and talk about these weighty issues on the weekend.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.